Don't touch me again, Lena whispered, her hand trembling as she pulled her sleeve back down over the fresh bruise blooming purple beneath her wrist. Dennis Frell's laugh cut through the diner like a blade. You'll do exactly what I say, or you'll be out on that street by sundown. She swallowed the fear rising in her throat, forced her lips into the smile customers expected, and picked up the coffee pot with a hand that would not stop shaking. Before we continue, if you're enjoying this story, please take a moment to subscribe to the channel and join us on this journey. And if you're watching right now, drop a comment below and tell us what city you're watching from. I read every single one, and I love seeing how far this story travels. Now let's get back to Lena. Twine. The morning air outside Route 9 Diner smelled like diesel and rain that hadn't fallen yet. Lena Carter stood in the employee bathroom with the door locked, staring at her reflection in a mirror that had a long crack running diagonally across it, like the crack was mocking her, like it knew exactly what she was doing every single morning. She had it down to a science now. Concealer first a shade darker than her actual skin tone because Bruises needed more coverage than people realized. Then a lighter shade blended over that to match. Then powder to set it. Then if the bruise was bad enough and this one on her cheekbone was bad enough, a second layer of concealer just at the center where the skin had split open 3 days ago and was only now beginning to look less like a wound and more like a bad decision. She had made peace with the routine the way a person makes peace with anything they cannot escape. Not happily, not even willingly, just quietly the way water settles into whatever shape contains it. Lena, Dennis's voice came through the door, sharp and impatient, the way it always was before 6 in the morning. You've got tables waiting. This isn't a spa. Coming, she called back, and her voice came out steady, which surprised her a little because nothing inside her felt steady at all. She pulled her long sleeves down past her wrists, checked once more that nothing showed, and unlocked the door. Dennis was standing right there when she opened it, close enough that she had to stop herself from flinching, close enough that his shadow fell over her before she even stepped into the hallway. He was a big man, thick through the shoulders, with a face that might have been handsome once, before it curdled into something permanently irritated. You know how this works, he said low only for her. You smile, you serve, you don't make me look bad in front of customers, and you sure as hell don't make me have another conversation with you about being late. I wasn't late. You were in there 4 minutes too long. He tilted his head, studying her face the way a man studies a used car he's trying to talk down in price. What you putting on a show for someone? Who exactly are you trying to impress, Lena? No one, she said quickly. I'm sorry, it won't happen again. Damn right it won't. He straightened, and just like that, his voice climbed back up into the register he used for customers' warm booming, fake. Get out there. Booth 4 has been waiting on coffee. She walked past him into the dining room, and the transformation happened the way it always did, like flipping a switch somewhere behind her ribs. Her shoulders came up half an inch, her chin lifted, her mouth curved into the smile that had gotten her through 400 in some odd mornings now, though she'd stopped counting somewhere around month 3. Morning, Mr. Holloway, she said to the man in booth 4, an old rancher who came in every day like clockwork. The usual. You know me too well, sweetheart? He smiled up at her, and for just a second, just 1 second, something in her chest loosened because Mr. Holloway's smile was the kind that didn't ask for anything back. Coming right up. She poured his coffee, refilled the cream, and moved down the counter with the kind of practiced efficiency that had become the only thing she was truly good at anymore. Order, pour, smile, repeat. It was a rhythm that asked nothing of the parts of her that were broken. It only asked for her hands, and her hands at least still worked. By 7, the diner was full. The regulars came in, waves the construction crew that liked their eggs over easy, and their coffee black, the 2 elderly sisters who split a single plate of pancakes every morning and left exactly the same tip every time the truckers passing through on the interstate who never came back twice. Dennis worked the register with the kind of showmanship that made strangers think he was a decent boss. He laughed loud. He called customers by name after one visit, whether he remembered them or not. He was by every outward measure a beloved local business owner. Only Lena and the other 2 waitresses, Carrie, who was 22 and saving for community college, and old Marge, who'd worked there longer than Dennis had owned the place, knew what happened after the doors closed. You okay? Carrie asked quietly, passing behind Lena at the coffee station, her voice pitched low enough that it wouldn't carry. I'm fine. You're not fine. Your face is doing that thing again. What thing? That thing where you're smiling but your eyes are somewhere else completely. Carrie's own eyes were soft with worry. Too soft, too young to understand yet how dangerous that kind of worry could be for both of them. Lena, if you need to talk. I don't. The words came out sharper than she meant them to. She softened them immediately. I'm sorry, I'm fine. Really. Carrie didn't push. She never did, not really not, after the one time she'd offered to walk Lena to her car, and Dennis had appeared out of nowhere smiling that customer smile and said, "Everything all right over here, ladies?" in a voice that made both of them go quiet immediately. Lena carried a tray of dirty dishes back toward the kitchen and let herself have exactly 3 seconds hidden behind the swinging door, where her face didn't have to hold any shape at all. 3 seconds where the exhaustion could show. 3 seconds where she could close her eyes and just breathe. Then she pushed back through the door and became the smiling waitress again. It happened at 10 in the morning during the lull between breakfast and lunch, when the diner had thinned out to just a handful of tables. Dennis called her into the back office, a cramped room that smelled like old coffee grounds and cigarette smoke. He thought no one noticed and closed the door behind her. "We've got a problem," he said, holding up a receipt. "Table 6's order was wrong, customer complained. Said you brought him the wrong eggs." "I brought him what he ordered." "That's not what he said." Dennis's voice was climbing already the way it did right before it turned into something worse. "You know what a complaint like that does to this place? You know how hard I work to keep this business afloat, and you're out there costing me customers because you can't get a simple order right. Dennis, I promise you, I wrote down exactly. Don't." He stepped closer and the small room seemed to shrink around them, the walls pressing in the way they always did when he got like this. "Don't you dare argue with me. You think I don't know what you're capable of. You think I haven't seen you slack off, take your time, daydream through your shifts, like you've got somewhere better to be. I haven't. I could fire you right now." His voice dropped to something quieter and somehow more frightening than the shouting. "Right now, today, you understand that you've got nothing without this job, no family in town, no savings? You think anyone else is hiring a waitress with your track record?" Lena's throat tightened. She kept her eyes on the floor on the cracked linoleum tile that she'd memorized the pattern of over the months because looking at him only ever made things worse. "I'm sorry," she said. "It won't happen again." "That's what you always say." "I mean it." He was quiet for a long moment, and in that silence she could hear her own heartbeat fast and shallow, the way it always got when she didn't know which version of him was about to show up next, the one who yelled and let it go, or the one whose hands didn't stay still. "Get back out there," he finally said, waving a hand like he was dismissing something beneath him. "And fix your face. You look like you've been crying. Customers don't tip crying waitresses." She hadn't been crying, not yet anyway, but she nodded and slipped back out into the dining room, and by the time she reached the counter, her smile was back in place, stitched on tight. The first mini-climax of the morning passed the way it always did, quietly and visibly. A small war fought entirely behind her eyes while the rest of the diner went on eating pancakes and drinking coffee. None of them any wiser. By 11:30, the lunch rush was beginning to build. Lena moved between tables on autopilot, taking orders, delivering plates, refilling glasses. The physical motion of the job, a kind of anesthetic against everything else. And then somewhere past noon she heard it. A low rumble, distant at first like thunder rolling in from somewhere over the hills. It grew steadily layering on itself, engine after engine after engine, until the sound wasn't distant anymore. It was right outside, filling the parking lot, rattling the windows of the diner in their frames. Every head in the place turned toward the front windows. "Lord," Marge muttered from behind the counter. "That's a lot of bikes." Lena set down the pitcher of water she'd been carrying and looked out through the glass. The parking lot, which usually held a handful of pickup trucks and the occasional sedan, was now genuinely filled with motorcycles. Rows of them chrome catching the midday sun engines, cutting off one by one, until the silence afterward felt almost louder than the noise had been. Leather jackets, patches on the backs that read Hell's Angels in bold, unmistakable letters. Men, a lot of men, more than 20 of them, swinging off their bikes with the easy, unhurried confidence of people who had never once in their lives worried about walking into a room and not belonging in it. The diner went dead quiet. "Oh boy," Carrie whispered, coming up beside Lena, her eyes wide. Dennis emerged from the back office at the sound of the engines, and for just a moment, one brief telling moment, Lena watched something flicker across his face that looked almost like fear, before it smoothed over into his customer smile, the big performative one. The one that meant he'd already started calculating how much money was about to walk through his door. "Well," he said, loud enough for the whole diner to hear, "looks like we've got company." The door swung open and the first of them stepped inside, a broad-shouldered man with a gray beard, followed by another and another, until the diner that had felt spacious a moment before now felt like it might burst at the seams. And then last through the door came a man who moved differently than the others. Where they walked in loud and easy laughing among themselves, he walked in quiet, watchful. His eyes swept the room once fast, cataloging everything in the exits, the customers, the layout before settling, and Lena felt that gaze land on her like a physical weight. He was maybe 50, with a neatly trimmed gray beard and gray hair swept back his leather vest, bearing a patch that marked him as different from the rest. Not louder, not flashier, but somehow more central, the way the eye of a storm is more central than its winds. "Sit anywhere you like, gentlemen," Dennis called out, his voice syrupy with forced hospitality. "We'll get you taken care of." The group began filing into booths and pulling tables together, filling half the diner in a matter of moments. Lena's hands had gone cold, though she couldn't have said why. She'd served bikers before. This wasn't the first leather jacket to walk through that door, but something about this felt different, and she didn't have the language yet for what that something was. "I've got table 2 through 6, Dennis announced, already moving toward the largest cluster of men with his order pad and his biggest smile. Lena Carey split the rest. Lena nodded and picked up her pad, walking toward the smaller booth near the window, where the gray-bearded man with the watchful eyes had taken a seat by himself, one boot propped against the opposite bench, studying the menu like he had all the time in the world. "Morning," she said, and her voice came out fine professional, the voice she used for every stranger who walked through that door. "Can I start you off with something to drink?" He looked up at her, and for one unbearable second, his eyes moved, not lecherous, not appraising in the way men's eyes sometimes did, but something else entirely. Something that felt like being seen in a way she hadn't been seen in longer than she wanted to think about. "Coffee," he said. "Black, and whatever you'd recommend for breakfast." "The Denver omelet's good," she said automatically. "Comes with hash browns and toast." "That'll do." She wrote it down, careful, steady, and turned to go, but his voice stopped her. "You always work mornings." The question was ordinary enough. Customers ask things like that all the time. Small talk to fill the space between order and food. But something in the way he asked it, patient, unhurried, like he genuinely wanted to know the answer, rather than just filling silence, made her hesitate half a second too long before answering. "Every day," she said. "I'll get your coffee started." She walked away faster than the moment required, and she didn't look back to see whether he was still watching her. He was. The lunch rush hit its stride, and Lena moved through it the way she moved through every rush, fast, efficient, present enough to keep every order straight, but absent enough that her mind could drift somewhere safer while her body did the work. Except this time, her mind kept drifting back to booth by the window. She caught herself glancing over more than once. He wasn't loud like the others who had already commandeered half the diner with booming laughter and stories that made Carrie blush, delivering their food. He sat mostly quiet, sipping his coffee, occasionally exchanging a low word with the men nearest him, but mostly, and this was the part that unsettled her most, mostly he watched. Not the room in general, her specifically. She brought his omelet out and set it down, and his eyes moved to her hands just briefly, just for a second, and she realized too late that her sleeve had ridden up slightly, exposing a thin sliver of bruising along the inside of her wrist, before she caught it and tugged the fabric back down. "You okay?" he asked. Quiet, not performative like Dennis's concern for show. Actual question. "I'm fine," she said, the automatic answer, the one that came without thought. "Enjoy your food." She turned to leave, but he spoke again low enough that only she could hear it. "Didn't ask if you were fine. Asked if you were okay." She froze for half a second, caught completely off guard by the distinction, by the fact that anyone had ever bothered to draw it before. "Same thing," she said finally, and walked away before he could answer. but her hands were shaking again by the time she reached the counter, and this time it had nothing to do with Dennis. The first real mini-climax of the day detonated 20 minutes later. Dennis came storming out from the back with a look on his face that Lena had learned to read, like whether the particular tightness around his jaw that meant something had gone wrong with the register or a supplier or anything at all that had put him in a mood he needed to unload on someone smaller than himself. Lena, his voice cracked across the diner loud enough that half the tables turned to look. Table 9's bill is short $11. You want to explain that to me? I rang it up exactly like they ordered, she said, walking toward him, keeping her voice level even as her stomach dropped. Then explain the discrepancy. Don't lie to me. He was close now, too close, his voice dropping into that register that made the hair on her arms stand up. The one that sounded calm to everyone else in the room, but that she knew from 400 mornings of experience was the most dangerous version of him. You've been doing this for weeks, skimming. You think I don't notice? Dennis, I would never. Give me your apron. His hand shot out and grabbed her wrist, the same wrist, the one still tender beneath her sleeve, and his grip closed tight enough that she gasped, a small involuntary sound that she hated herself for making in front of a room full of strangers. You're hurting me, she whispered. Then stop stealing from me. The diner had gone quiet, genuinely quiet, the kind of silence that meant everyone was watching and no one was moving, the particular cowardice of strangers who don't know what they're allowed to do about another person's pain. And then a chair scraped back. Rex Malone stood up. He didn't rush. He didn't raise his voice. He crossed the small distance between his booth and the counter with the unhurried certainty of a man who had never once in his life needed to move fast to be taken seriously, and when he spoke, his voice was low, calm, and utterly final. That's enough. 2 words, that was all. But something about the way he said them, not a threat, not a challenge, just a simple statement of fact. The way a man might announce that it had stopped raining made the entire diner go still in a different way than before. Dennis's hand loosened on Lena's wrist, more from surprise than choice. Excuse me, Dennis said, turning his customer smile flickering back on out of pure habit even as his eyes went hard. This is a private matter, friend, between me and my employee. Don't look private to me. Rex's eyes moved from Dennis's face down to his hand still hovering near Lena's arm and back up again. Looks like a grown man twisting the wrist of a woman half his size in front of a room full of witnesses. You don't know what you're talking about. I know exactly what I'm looking at. Rex's voice hadn't risen at all, not even slightly, and somehow that made it more unsettling than shouting would have been. I've seen it before. Man who talks big when he thinks no one's paying attention. Man who needs somebody smaller to feel like somebody at all. A murmur rippled through the diner. Lena stood frozen between the 2 men, her wrist throbbing faintly where Dennis's fingers had dug in her mind, racing too fast to land on any single coherent thought. You need to sit back down, Dennis said, though his voice had lost some of its certainty. This is my establishment. And that's your employee, Rex said, who you just grabbed hard enough to leave a mark in front of 24 customers over $11. He let the silence sit for a moment before continuing. Now, I don't know you and I don't know your business, and normally that wouldn't be any concern of mine. Man runs his diner how he wants. But you put your hands on somebody like that in front of me, that becomes my business real quick. Dennis's face had gone a mottled shade of red, the particular color of a man who was used to being the loudest, biggest presence in any room he entered, and who had just discovered in real time that this was no longer true. Get out, Dennis said, but the words came out weaker than he intended. Get out of my diner. We'll leave when we're ready, Rex said, and we'll leave a damn good tip on the way out too for her. He nodded slightly toward Lena without looking away from Dennis. Not for you. The room held its breath. For one unbearable, suspended moment, it seemed like Dennis might actually do something. His hands curled into fists at his sides, his jaw working the vein at his temple standing out in sharp relief. 20-some bikers sat scattered through his diner, all of them now watching, all of them quiet, and all of them somehow radiating the same unhurried, immovable calm as their leader. Then something in Dennis's shoulders sagged almost imperceptibly, the posture of a man recalculating the odds and not liking what he found. Fine, he muttered. Fine, whatever. He turned to Lena, jabbing a finger toward the back of the diner. Get back to work. He stalked off toward the office and the door slammed hard enough to rattle the framed photographs on the wall beside it. Lena stood frozen at the counter, her wrists still aching, her breath coming shallow and fast, painfully aware that every single person in the diner was looking at her. "You all right?" Rex asked, quiet just for her. She opened her mouth to say, "I'm fine," the automatic answer, the one that had carried her through 400 mornings. But the words wouldn't come. For the first time in longer than she could remember, the lie simply refused to form. "I don't know," she whispered instead, and it was the most honest thing she'd said out loud in over a year. The rest of the lunch service passed in a strange suspended haze. Word of what had happened rippled quietly through the diner. Customers who hadn't seen it directly asked those who had voices, dropped low glances thrown toward the back office where Dennis had shut himself away. Lena kept working because working was the only thing that she knew how to do with her hands when her mind was somewhere else entirely. She refilled coffees. She delivered plates. She avoided looking directly at Booth by the window, though she was aware with an awareness that felt almost like a physical sensation on her skin that Rex Malone was still watching her. Carrie found her by the coffee station, eyes wide, voice hushed with something that was half excitement and half genuine concern. Lena, are you okay? He grabbed you so hard I saw the mark." "I'm fine," Lena said, and this time the lie came easier because it had to. "That man just stood up to Dennis in front of everybody. Nobody's ever done that." "I know. Do you know him? Have you seen him before?" "No." Lena glanced just once toward the window booth and found Rex's eyes already on her, patient, unhurried, waiting for nothing in particular except perhaps to see whether she would look back. "I've never seen him before in my life." But something about the way he'd said, "I've seen it before," stayed lodged in her chest like a splinter. She couldn't quite work free. He hadn't spoken like a stranger defending someone out of general decency. He'd spoken like a man who recognized a pattern, like he'd watched this exact scene play out before in some other diner, some other town, with some other frightened woman standing exactly where Lena was standing now. She wondered, not for the first time that day, what it would take for a man to learn to recognize that kind of fear so quickly. In some small buried part of her, a part she hadn't let herself listen to in a very long time, wondered whether he might already know the answer better than she did. By 2 o'clock, the bikers began settling their bills, the group thinning out table by table as men filed toward the door, boots heavy on the linoleum, voices dropping back into easy conversation now that the tension of the earlier confrontation had faded into background noise. Lena found herself almost against her will, tracking Rex's movements across the room. He didn't rush to leave. He finished his coffee. He spoke briefly to a couple of the other men. Low words she couldn't hear, and something about their body language, the way they nodded, the way they seemed to defer to him without any visible hierarchy being enforced, told her he was the one they all orbited around, whether or not anyone had ever said so out loud. When he finally stood, he didn't head for the door right away. He walked instead toward the counter where Lena was cashing out a departing customer and waited patient until she was free. "Your total's on the ticket," she said, keeping her voice carefully neutral, professional, the same voice she used for everyone. "I know." He set a folded bill on the counter, more than enough to cover the meal several times over, and didn't move to take change. "That's not why I'm here." "Sir, I really can't. I'm not asking you to take anything you don't want," he said, cutting her off gently, not unkindly. "I just want to say something, and then I'll go." She stilled her hand, hovering over the register, unsure whether to brace herself or lean in. "That man in there," Rex said, nodding faintly toward the closed office door. "I've seen his kind before, more than once. They don't stop on their own. They just get better at hiding it, or they find somebody who won't hide it anymore." He paused, and his eyes, steady and unreadable, held hers in a way that made her want to look away, and somehow made it impossible to. "You don't have to tell me anything. I'm not asking. But I want you to know what happened out here today. That's not normal. That's not something you have to keep living with just because it's what you're used to." Lena's throat tightened, and she felt the sting of tears threatening behind her eyes. Tears she absolutely could not afford to shed in the middle of a shift, in front of a stranger, in front of anyone at all. "I appreciate you stepping in," she managed, "but I don't need—" "I know you didn't ask for help." His voice was gentle now, none of the hard edge that had cut through the diner earlier. "That's not what this is. I just wanted you to hear out loud from somebody who isn't afraid of him. You didn't do anything wrong. Not today, not with the register, not with any of it." She had no answer for that. No practice deflection, no automatic script. The words simply lodged somewhere in her chest and stayed there foreign and enormous because no one, not Carrie, not Marge, not a single soul in this town had ever said them to her quite so plainly. "I have to get back to work," she whispered, because it was the only thing she could think to say that wouldn't break something open inside her, right there at the register. "Understood." Rex nodded once and turned to go, falling in step with the last of his group as they filed out toward the parking lot. The engine started up again, outside one after another, building into that same rolling thunder that had announced their arrival hours earlier. Lena watched through the window as they pulled out onto Route 9, the whole convoy of them chrome flashing in the afternoon sun until they rounded the bend and the sound of them faded into nothing. The diner felt strangely quiet in their absence. The ordinary Tuesday afternoon quiet of a place that had, for one unexpected hour, held something far larger than itself. Lena stood at the register for a long moment staring at nothing, her wrists still throbbing faintly, her mind circling that one sentence over and over. "You didn't do anything wrong." She had heard it. She had let it in just far enough to hurt. Behind her, the office door creaked open, and Dennis stepped back out into the dining room, his face composed now into something almost pleasant, almost normal, as though the last hour hadn't happened at all. "Get this place cleaned up," he said, his voice carrying that familiar edge beneath the surface calm. "And Lena," he paused, and for just a moment, something flickered behind his eyes that looked almost like uncertainty, almost like a man recalculating something he'd never had to recalculate before. "We'll talk about today later." Lena's stomach dropped straight through the floor, because she knew exactly what "we'll talk about it later" meant in the private language of every day she'd survived in this place. It meant the calm wouldn't last. It meant tonight, after the diner closed and the lights went dark, and there was no room full of witnesses left to see the bill for today's humiliation would come due. She picked up her rag and began wiping down the counter with hands that had started very quietly to shake again, not from fear alone this time, but from something new and unfamiliar stirring beneath it. Somewhere in her apron pocket, though she didn't know it yet, tucked into the corner where she kept her order pad, a small folded piece of paper waited pressed there in the brief moment Rex had reached past her to steady a toppling napkin dispenser, so quick and so quiet she hadn't even felt it happen. She wouldn't find it until much later that night, alone in the dark, with the sound of Dennis's footsteps still echoing in her memory. But it was there, waiting. A single phone number, and beneath it 4 words that would change absolutely everything. "In case you need." The rag went still in Lena's hand the moment the last customer walked out, and Dennis flipped the sign on the door from open to closed. The silence that followed was the kind she had learned to dread more than shouting. Shouting meant he was still performing, still aware that a stray customer might walk back in, still capable of restraint. Silence meant the performance was over. "Sit down," Dennis said, not looking at her, busy counting out the register with sharp, irritated movements. "I still need to finish wiping the thing." I said, "Sit down." She sat. Marge had already left for the day, and Carrie had been sent home early. Dennis's doing, though he dressed it up as a kindness, telling her she looked tired, telling her to go rest. Lena understood now, sitting alone in a dining room lit by half its lights, exactly why he'd wanted the diner empty. He finished counting, slammed the drawer shut, and turned to face her, arms crossed, a muscle working in his jaw. "You want to explain to me what that was today?" "I didn't ask him to do anything." "You didn't have to ask. You stood there and let him make me look like a fool in front of 24 customers?" His voice climbed, cracked at the edges. 20 years I've run this place. 20 years, and some biker walks in off the street and decides he's going to lecture me about how I run my business. "He saw you grab me, Dennis. Everyone saw." "Don't." The word came out low, dangerous, and she felt her whole body brace on instinct, the way a person braces against a door they know is about to slam. "Don't you dare turn this around on me. You think I don't know what you were doing?" Making eyes at him all through lunch, playing the victim so he'd jump in and save you. "That's not what happened." "That's exactly what happened." He took a step closer, and she felt the counter's edge against her lower back where she'd instinctively pressed herself against it, a small animal calculation of distance and escape that she performed a dozen times a day without ever fully registering she was doing it. "You embarrassed me, in my own place. And now half this town's going to hear about how Dennis Frell got put in his place by some gang of criminals. They weren't criminals. They paid. They tipped. They left. Don't talk back to me. I'm not. His hand shot out and caught her by the shoulder, hard enough that she gasped the same fast, ugly motion she'd felt 100 times before, and for one terrible second, she thought this was it. This was the night it finally went further than a bruise she could hide with a concealer. Then unexpectedly, he let go. Not out of mercy. Lena understood that immediately, reading it in the sudden tightness around his eyes. The quick, involuntary glance toward the front windows still faintly lit by the parking lot lamp outside. He wasn't afraid of hurting her. He was afraid of being seen doing it. Today had planted something in him that hadn't been there yesterday, the fear that eyes might be watching that he couldn't control, couldn't intimidate, couldn't buy off with a fake smile and a free breakfast. Get out of my sight, he muttered, stepping back, straightening his shirt like the whole exchange had been beneath him. Be here at 6 tomorrow. And Lena? He paused at the office door, not quite looking back at her. If any of those bikers come around here again, you tell them this place doesn't want their business. You understand me? I understand, she said, because it was easier than the truth, which was that she understood nothing at all anymore. Not this town, not this job, not the strange hollow feeling lodged behind her ribs since the moment a stranger had told her plainly that none of this was her fault. She grabbed her jacket and her bag and left through the back door before he could change his mind about letting her go so easily. The walk home took 11 minutes if she moved fast, and she always moved fast, especially after dark, especially on nights like this one when her nerves were still raw and every passing headlight made her flinch. She lived above a shuttered hardware store, 2 blocks off Main Street, a single room with a hot plate and a mattress on the floor, and a window that didn't quite close all the way, so that in winter she slept in 2 sweaters just to keep the cold out. It wasn't much. It had never been much. But it was hers paid for with her own money, and some nights that fact alone was the only thing that kept her upright. She climbed the narrow stairs, let herself in and locked the door deadbolt chain, the wooden chair she wedged under the knob, even though she knew rationally it wouldn't stop anyone determined enough to get in. The ritual wasn't really about safety, it was about the illusion of it, and some nights the illusion was enough to let her sleep. She peeled off her uniform, hung it on the single hook behind the door, and sat down heavily on the edge of the mattress, finally alone with everything the day had handed her. Her shoulder throbbed where Dennis had grabbed her. Her wrist ached where the bruise from 3 days ago had been reopened by his grip earlier that afternoon. She sat in the dim light of her one working lamp and cataloged the damage, the way she always did. An old grim habit, checking herself over like a mechanic, checking a car for what might need fixing before the next trip out. It was while she was hanging up her apron that her fingers found the folded slip of paper tucked into the corner pocket. She frowned, pulled it free, and unfolded it under the lamp. A phone number written in careful block letters, and beneath it 4 words that hit her harder than she expected, harder than they had any right to. In case you need. She sat very still, staring at it, her heart doing something strange and unfamiliar in her chest, not fear for once, something closer to disbelief. No one had ever left her a door before. Every relationship in her life since she'd taken this job had been built entirely around walls. Dennis's control, her own silence, the careful architecture of survival that required her to never ever imagine an exit, because imagining an exit and not being able to reach it was its own kind of cruelty. And here was a stranger, a man she'd spoken to for maybe 10 total minutes, offering her a door and asking for nothing in return. She turned the paper over in her hands like it might reveal some hidden catch, some price she hadn't noticed yet. There wasn't one. Just the number. Just the 4 words. She thought about calling right then in the dark, with her hands still trembling faintly from the day. She got as far as picking up her phone, pulling up the keypad, typing in the first 3 digits before her thumb froze over the screen. What would she even say? Hey, you probably don't remember me. The waitress from the diner, the one whose boss grabbed her in front of you. She deleted the numbers and set the phone face down on the mattress beside her, ashamed of herself for even considering it, for needing it, for the small, traitorous part of her that wanted so badly to hear a voice that wasn't asking anything of her. She folded the paper carefully and tucked it beneath the corner of her mattress, out of sight, out of reach of anyone who might come looking through her things, though no one ever did, though she was the only person who had set foot in this room in months. Then she turned off the lamp and lay in the dark, listening to the hardware store's old pipes groan in the walls, and did not sleep for a long, long time. Morning came the way it always did, too early, too loud, her alarm cutting through a sleep so thin it barely qualified as rest. She went through the routine. Concealer powder sleeves, her shoulder had bruised overnight, a dull yellow-green shadow blooming beneath her collarbone that required an extra layer to hide beneath her uniform collar. Her hands moved through the process with the same detached efficiency they always had, though something in her chest felt different this morning. Some small crack of light let in that hadn't been there before. You didn't do anything wrong. The words followed her down the stairs, through the cold morning air, into the diner where Dennis was already waiting, his mood recalibrated back to its usual performance of cheerful authority, as though last night's conversation had never happened. "Morning sunshine," he said, not looking up from the register. "Big day. Church crowds coming through after 9. "Morning," she said, and slipped past him toward the coffee station, grateful for once that his attention had already moved on to something else. The day passed in its usual rhythm. Orders, plates, refills, the small, exhausting choreography of survival dressed up as customer service. But something had shifted subtly in the air of the diner itself. Carrie kept glancing toward her with a new kind of attention, like she was waiting for something to happen. Marge, usually silent and unreadable, caught Lena's eye once across the kitchen pass-through and gave her the smallest nod, the kind that said without words, "I saw what happened yesterday. I see you." Even Dennis seemed different. Not kinder, never that, but more careful. He didn't grab her once that whole shift. He didn't even raise his voice past its usual customer register. And Lena understood with a clarity that unsettled her more than it comforted her exactly why. He was afraid the bikers might come back. They didn't come back that day. Or the next. A full week passed and the diner settled back into its ordinary rhythm, the memory of leather jackets and low dangerous voices fading into something the regulars occasionally mentioned in passing. Remember when that biker gang rolled through, but which otherwise seemed to belong to some other more dramatic version of the town? Lena told herself she was relieved. She told herself the number folded beneath her mattress was nothing more than a kind gesture from a stranger passing through, the kind of thing that meant something in the moment and nothing at all once the moment had passed. She told herself this every single day, and every single day some part of her that she couldn't quite silence checked her phone a little too often, waited a little too long by the window. When she heard an engine in the distance, felt something twist in her chest each time the sound faded and no convoy of motorcycles appeared. It was on the 9th day that everything changed again. Dennis had been drinking. She could smell it on him from across the dining room, sharp and sour beneath his cologne, and her stomach dropped the moment she caught it, because drinking Dennis was a different animal entirely from sober Dennis, louder, faster, to anger, less predictable in every way that mattered. The lunch rush had been slow tips thin, and by 2 in the afternoon he'd worked himself into a mood that radiated off him like heat off asphalt. "Table 3's leaving without paying," he snapped at her, though she hadn't even served table 3. "You didn't run their card before they left." "I didn't seat table 3, that was Carrie's section." "Don't make excuses." He crossed the dining room faster than she expected and grabbed her arm before she could step back, his fingers digging into the same bruised shoulder from over a week ago, the mark barely healed. "You people think this place runs itself. You think money just falls out of the sky. Dennis, you're hurting me. Maybe you should have thought of that before you let your section walk out on a bill." "It wasn't my section." The words came out louder than she intended, sharper the first time, and longer than she could remember that she'd raised her voice back at him in front of witnesses, and something about the shock of her own volume seemed to startle Dennis too, his grip tightening reflexively in response, like a man grabbing harder at something trying to slip away from him. "Let her go." Marge's voice cut across the dining room flat and hard, the old woman standing at the pass-through with a spatula still in her hand. "Dennis, let her go right now, or I swear to God I'm calling the sheriff myself." "Stay out of this, Marge." "I said let her go." For a long suspended moment, nothing moved. Dennis's fingers stayed locked around Lena's arm, his face flushed with anger and whiskey, his eyes darting between Marge's hard stare and the 2 remaining customers, who had gone very quiet, very still in their booth by the window. Then slowly his grip loosened. "This isn't over," he muttered, releasing her, and stalked back toward his office, slamming the door hard enough to rattle the framed photos on the wall. Lena stood frozen at the center of the dining room, her arm throbbing, her breath coming too fast, and Marge crossed the floor in a few brisk steps and put a hand, gentle this time, so gentle it nearly undid her, on Lena's shoulder. "Honey," Marge said quietly, "this can't keep happening." I know. Do you? Because it's been going on for months now, and every time you tell yourself it's the last time, and it never is. Marge's eyes were wet, and Lena realized with a jolt that the older woman had been carrying this worry silently for far longer than Lena had ever let herself notice. You've got somewhere to go. You've got that number that biker left you. Carrie told me. Carrie wasn't supposed to. Carrie was worried about you same as I am. Marge squeezed her shoulder. Call it Lena, please, before something happens that can't be undone. That night alone in her room, Lena sat on the edge of her mattress with the folded slip of paper in her lap for a long time before she finally dialed the number. It rang twice before a voice answered, low, unmistakable, the same steady calm she remembered from the diner. Yeah, her mouth went dry. Hi, this is Lena from the diner, Route 9. A pause on the other end, brief but noticeable. I remember you. His voice had shifted, softened slightly, though it lost none of its steadiness. You all right? I don't know, she admitted, and the honesty of it surprised her all over again the way it had that first day at the counter. He grabbed me at it again today, in front of customers. My coworker, she said I should call you. I'm sorry, I don't even know why Don't apologize. His voice cut through her, spiraling gently but firmly. You did the right thing calling. Where are you right now? Home, my apartment. Are you safe tonight? Is he there? Is he going to come looking for you? No, he's never done that. He doesn't know where I live. Good. A brief pause, and she could hear something shifting on his end, the sound of him moving a door opening somewhere in the background. Listen to me. I'm not going to tell you what to do. This is your life, your choice. And I meant what I said that day. Nobody's going to pressure you into anything you're not ready for. But I want you to know whatever you decide, you're not doing this alone anymore. You understand? Her throat tightened, and she pressed the back of her hand against her mouth to keep the sound that wanted to escape from actually escaping. I don't know what I'm supposed to do, she whispered. You don't have to know tonight. His voice was steady, patient, the same unhurried calm that had filled the diner that first day. Tonight, you just need to get some sleep and know that number's not going anywhere. Tomorrow, if you want, we can talk more, but only if you want to. Okay, she said, and something in her chest loosened, just slightly, just enough to let her breathe a little deeper than she had and longer than she could remember. Lena, his voice right before she could hang up. For what it's worth, you calling tonight that took more guts than most people ever have to find in a lifetime. Don't forget that. She hung up the phone and sat in the dark for a long time afterward, crying quietly, though she couldn't have said whether it was from fear or relief or some combination of both that she didn't yet have a name for. The days that followed carried a strange, fragile new rhythm. Lena went to work each morning and endured Dennis's moods, hid her bruises beneath concealer and long sleeves. But underneath the exhaustion, something had shifted. She had a lifeline now, however thin, however new. She texted Rex twice that week, short messages, nothing dramatic. Bad day today, and he's back to normal. I think whatever normal means. And each time his replies came steady and unhurried. Never pushing, never demanding more than she was willing to give. It was enough for a while to simply know someone was there. Then came the Tuesday that broke the fragile equilibrium apart entirely. Dennis called her into the office an hour before closing, his face unreadable, in a way that immediately set every alarm in her body ringing. Sit down, he said. I have tables. Sit down. She sat, her hands folding tight in her lap, bracing for whatever version of him was about to surface. He didn't yell. That was somehow worse. He simply stared at her for a long moment, his jaw working before he spoke, his voice flat and cold, in a way she'd never heard from him before. I know you've been talking to them. Her stomach dropped straight through the floor. What? Don't play stupid with me. I saw your phone light up on the counter last week. Saw the name. Rex. He said the name like something bitter in his mouth. You've been running to those bikers, telling them God knows what about how I run my business. I haven't told them anything. You think I'm an idiot? His voice climbed now, the anger she recognized flooding back into his face. You embarrass me in front of my customers, and then you go crying to a gang of outlaws about it behind my back. You have any idea what you're doing? You have any idea what kind of people you're dealing with? They're not what you think. I don't care what they are. He slammed his hand flat against the desk, and she flinched hard, her whole body curling in on itself instinctively. You work for me. You understand, not for them, me. And if I find out you've been talking to them behind my back one more time, I swear to God, Lena, you will regret it. Is that a threat? The question came out before she could stop it, quiet but steady, and something in her own voice surprised her. A thread of steel she hadn't known was still in there, buried beneath months of learned silence. Dennis's eyes narrowed. Careful, he said low. You're forgetting your place. My place, she repeated, and stood up slowly, her legs shaking, but her voice somehow steady. My place is wherever I decide it is, not wherever you decide to put me. For a moment, Dennis looked almost startled, like a man who'd trained a dog for years, only to have it suddenly bare its teeth. Then his face hardened into something uglier. You're fired, he said. Get your things. Get out of my diner. The words landed like a physical blow, and for one dizzying second, the floor seemed to tilt beneath her. Every fear she'd carried for months, every threat he'd ever made about her having nothing without this job, crystallizing all at once into this single moment of free fall. But underneath the fear, something else was stirring too, something that felt unexpectedly almost like relief. Fine, she said, and her voice didn't shake at all this time. Fine. She walked out of the office, grabbed her jacket from the hook by the back door, and left without looking back, walking straight past a stunned Carrie, past Marge's wide, worried eyes out into the parking lot, where the evening air felt colder and freer than it had any right to feel. She got 3 blocks before her legs gave out, and she had to sit down on a bus bench, her whole body trembling, the reality of what had just happened crashing over her in waves. No job, no income, no plan. Everything Dennis had threatened her with for months finally actually true. She pulled out her phone with shaking hands and called the only number that felt safe to call. Rex picked up on the second ring. Lena. He fired me, she said, and her voice cracked wide open on the last word, months of held-together composure finally splitting apart all at once. He found out I'd been talking to you, and he fired me, and I don't have anywhere. Where are you right now? His voice had gone instantly sharp alert, all the patient calm replaced by something quick and focused. Bus bench, corner of 5th and Main. Stay right there. Don't go anywhere else. You understand me? I'm coming. Rex, you don't have to. I'm already in the truck, he said, and she heard an engine roar to life on the other end of the line. 15 minutes. Stay put. The line went dead, and Lena sat alone on the bench in the gathering dark, clutching her phone to her chest, crying now without any attempt to hide it, because for the first time in longer than she could remember, there was no one left to perform for. She had lost everything Dennis had built his control around the job, the paycheck, the fragile illusion of stability, and somehow impossibly sitting there in the cold with nothing left to lose, she felt lighter than she had in over a year. The truck pulled up 9 minutes later. Rex had broken every speed limit in town to get there. She'd learn later, though, he never once mentioned it himself, and he was out of the driver's seat and crossing in the sidewalk toward her before the engine had even fully stopped. Hey, he crouched down in front of the bench, his voice gentle now. None of the sharp urgency from the phone call. Hey, look at me. You're okay. You're safe. I've got you. I don't have anywhere to go, she said, the words tumbling out fast, panicked. My rent's due in 2 weeks. I don't have another job lined up. One thing at a time, he held out a hand, not touching her, just offering it, palm up, patient. First thing first, you're not sitting on a bus bench in the cold. Let's get you somewhere warm, and then we figure out everything else. Together. You don't have to solve this whole thing tonight. She looked at his hand for a longer moment and really looked at it, the calluses, the small white scar across one knuckle, the steadiness of it held out toward her without a single flicker of impatience. Then slowly she reached out and took it. Okay, she whispered. Okay, he echoed and helped her to her feet. Oh. He didn't take her far, a small diner 3 towns over, quiet, nearly empty, at this hour where he ordered her a cup of tea she didn't ask for and sat across from her in a corner booth while she slowly, haltingly told him everything. Not just about today, about all of it. The months of walking on eggshells, the concealer routine perfected to a science, the threats about having nowhere else to go, no family, no savings, nothing but Dennis's diner standing between her and total collapse. He listened without interrupting, his jaw tightening at certain details, his hands curling briefly into fists on the table before he consciously relaxed them again, but he never once looked away, never once made her feel like her pain was too much for the room to hold. "You know none of that was true, right?" he said quietly when she'd finally run out of words. "What he told you about having nothing without him. I know that now, sort of." She wrapped both hands around the mug of tea, grateful for the warmth. "It's hard to unlearn something you've heard every single day for over a year." "It is." His voice carried a weight she hadn't heard in it before, something old and hard-earned. "Takes time, but you'll get there." "How do you know?" He was quiet for a moment, his eyes dropping briefly to the table before finding hers again. "Because I've watched it happen before, more times than I wish I had to." Something in the way he said it, careful guarded like a door he wasn't ready to fully open yet, told her there was more beneath those words than he was prepared to share tonight. She didn't push. She understood better than most people ever could the particular exhaustion of being asked to explain pain before you were ready to name it. "What happens now?" she asked instead. "Now," Rex said, "we get you somewhere safe tonight. Tomorrow we figure out the rest. There's people I know, good people, people who've helped folks in situations like yours before. You're not doing this alone. Not anymore." Lena looked down at the tea in her hands, steam still curling faintly off its surface, and felt something inside her chest. Something that had been clenched tight for over a year, braced against every possible blow, began very slowly to loosen. "Thank you," she whispered. "Don't thank me yet." A faint, almost smile touched the corner of his mouth. "We've got a lot of work ahead of us." Outside the window, the sound of distant thunder rolled across the darkening sky, the first storm of the season gathering, somewhere out past the hills, moving slowly, inevitably toward town. Neither of them could have known yet just how much that storm would end up mirroring what was coming, because 3 days later, Dennis Frell would make one phone call that would set in motion something far larger than either of them expected. Something that would drag old debts, old secrets, and an entire network of buried corruption out into the light. But that night, in a quiet diner 3 towns over, Lena Carter simply drank her tea, breathed a little easier than she had in over a year, and allowed herself for the first time in a very long time to believe that maybe, just maybe, she really was no longer invisible. The phone call came at 7 the next morning, while Lena was still sitting on the edge of a borrowed bed in the small guest room above Rex's garage, staring at her hands like she wasn't quite sure they belonged to her anymore. Rex knocked twice before opening the door partway. "You up?" "Didn't really sleep." She looked up at him, and something in her chest still hadn't caught up to the fact that this was real, that there was a room and a lock that worked, and a man on the other side of that door who had spent the whole night making sure she had everything she needed without once making her feel like a burden for needing it. "What's going on?" That was Marge, from the diner. His face had gone tight, careful the way it got when he was choosing his words before he said them. "You should probably hear this yourself." He handed her the phone and Lena pressed it to her ear, her stomach already tightening in anticipation. "Marge." "Honey, thank God." Marge's voice was fast, breathless, nothing like the steady, unshakable woman Lena had worked beside for 2 years. "Listen to me. Dennis is telling people you stole from him. He called the sheriff this morning, filed some kind of report, said you'd been skimming the register for months, and that's why he had to let you go." Lena's blood went cold. "That's not true. None of that is true." "I know that, and Carrie knows that, but the sheriff doesn't know that, and Dennis has been running this town's gossip mill for 20 years. He's already got half of Route 9 believing it." Marge's voice dropped lower, urgent. "He's not done, Lena. I heard him on the phone with someone this morning, real quiet, real careful, like he didn't want anyone hearing. Something about making sure you didn't cause any more trouble." The words landed like ice water down her spine. "What does that mean?" "I don't know, but I've worked for that man 11 years, and I've never heard him sound like that before. Careful like that. Scared almost." A pause. "You be careful, you hear me? Whatever's going on, it's bigger than a wrongful termination." Lena lowered the phone slowly, her hand trembling, and looked up to find Rex watching her, with an expression that had shifted from concern into something harder, more focused. "He's accusing me of stealing," she said. "Filed a police report." "Did you steal anything?" "No, never, not once." "Then that's easy enough to prove wrong." Rex's jaw was tight, but his voice stayed level, the same deliberate calm she'd first noticed in the diner. "But I don't like the sound of the rest of it. A man like that panicking enough to lie to the sheriff, that's not a man protecting his pride. That's a man protecting something bigger. What could he possibly be hiding? It's a diner. That's what we're going to find out. Yeah. By mid-morning, Rex had gathered 3 men around the kitchen table in the small house behind the garage. Men Lena recognized vaguely from the diner that first day, though she hadn't known their names until now. Tank, a broad, quiet man with forearms like tree trunks and a gentleness in his eyes that contradicted his size entirely. Duke, older, silver-bearded with the watchful stillness of someone who'd spent a lifetime reading rooms before he ever spoke in them. And Cole, younger than the others, sharp-eyed, already tapping away at a laptop like he'd been waiting for exactly this kind of problem to solve. Dennis Frell, Cole said, scrolling through something on the screen. Owns the diner outright, no mortgage on record, which is interesting considering he bought the place 8 years ago for a number that doesn't match up with any loan history I can find. Meaning what, Westwam? Lena asked, sitting stiffly at the edge of the table, still not entirely sure she belonged in this conversation, still waiting for someone to tell her to leave. Meaning either he had the cash sitting around, which seems unlikely for a diner owner in a town this size, Cole said, or the money came from somewhere he doesn't want on paper. There's more, Duke added, his voice a low rumble. Property records show 3 other parcels registered under a holding company, Frell Route 9 LLC, 2 vacant lots on the edge of town, and 1 building that used to be a feed store shut down for the last 4 years. So he's a landlord, Lena said. That's not exactly a criminal empire. Maybe not, Rex said, but a man who's careful enough to hide his money in shell companies isn't a man who panics over a stolen paycheck complaint. He panicked because you're connected to us now, and that tells me he's worried about eyes on his business that weren't there before. Lena sat with that for a long moment, turning it over, feeling the shape of something much larger than she'd ever imagined lurking somewhere beneath the surface of her ordinary, exhausting life at that diner. What do we do? She finally asked. We find out what he's hiding, Rex said, quietly, carefully, and in the meantime, you stay here where he can't reach you. The sheriff came by that afternoon, not to the garage, but to Marge's house, where she called Lena immediately afterward, her voice tight with barely controlled anger. They want to talk to you, Marge said, about the theft accusation. Sheriff Boyd, he's always been friendly with Dennis. Play golf together, I think. I don't like it, honey. I have to go in eventually, Lena said. If I don't, it just makes it look worse. Then you don't go alone. She didn't. Rex drove her to the small sheriff's station himself, parking directly in front, unbothered by the way the receptionist's eyes widened at the sight of a Hells Angels vest walking through the door beside a woman half his size. Sheriff Boyd was a stout man in his 50s, with a mustache that had gone entirely gray, in a manner that struck Lena immediately as performatively casual, too relaxed, too friendly, the posture of a man who already believed he knew how this conversation was going to end. Miss Carter, he gestured to a chair across from his desk, his eyes flicking once briefly to Rex, who took up positions, standing near the door, arms crossed, saying nothing. Appreciate you coming in. This won't take long. I didn't steal anything from that diner, Lena said before he could even begin. Not a dollar, not once in 2 years. Well, that's certainly what you'd say. Boyd's smile stayed easy, unbothered. Dennis has receipts showing discrepancies going back months. Says it lines up with your shifts. Then I want to see them. Something flickered across Boyd's face, brief, almost imperceptible, but Lena caught it, and beside her she felt Rex go very still, the particular stillness of a predator noticing movement in the grass. They're part of an ongoing matter, Boyd said. I can't just hand over evidence. You can't hand over evidence, Rex said, speaking for the first time, his voice low and even, because there isn't any. Is that about the size of it, Sheriff? Boyd's easy smile hardened at the edges. I don't believe I asked for your opinion. You didn't have to. I've sat across a lot of desks like this one, and I know the difference between a man building a case and a man covering for a friend. Rex took a step closer to the desk, unhurried, and Lena watched Boyd's hand drift almost involuntarily toward the edge of his own desk drawer. Dennis Frell grabbed this woman hard enough to bruise her twice in front of witnesses. Fired her the same week she started asking questions about who he owes money to. And now he's filed a theft complaint with no receipts to back it up against a woman who's never had so much as a parking ticket. Rex's eyes didn't waver. You want to explain to me why that doesn't sound like a case at all? Sounds a whole lot more like a favor. The room went very quiet. I'd be careful, Boyd said, his voice dropping into something with a harder edge beneath the surface friendliness. Making accusations you can't prove. I'm not accusing you of anything, Sheriff. Rex's tone stayed perfectly level. Just noticing, and I've got a lot of time on my hands to keep noticing things if that's what this is going to take. Boyd's jaw tightened, and for a moment the performative friendliness dropped away entirely, revealing something colder and more calculating underneath. Then just as quickly, it snapped back into place. We'll be in touch, Miss Carter, he said, standing signaling the meeting was over. Don't leave the county. They walked out into the afternoon light, and Lena didn't speak until they were both back in the truck, her hand still shaking slightly in her lap. He's lying, she said. There's no evidence? There's nothing. No, Rex agreed, starting the engine. There isn't, which means somebody's protecting Dennis. And I'd very much like to know who. 3 nights later, the first real break came, and it came from the last place Lena expected. Carrie showed up at the garage unannounced, breathless, having driven straight there after her shift, without even changing out of her uniforms, her eyes wide with something between fear and excitement. You need to see this, she said, thrusting her phone toward Lena the second the door opened. I found it in the back office. He left his laptop open. I wasn't even trying to look. I swear, but I saw your name and I... Slow down, Rex said, guiding her inside, sitting her down at the kitchen table. Breathe. Tell us what you saw. Carrie took a shaky breath and turned the phone around. On the screen was a photograph she'd taken of an open email sender address, partially visible, subject line reading R, Route 9, parcel timeline update. It's from someone named Marcus Whitfield, Carrie said. I don't know who that is, but the email it talks about needing the diner property cleared for a development deal and something about needing to make sure there's, quote, no complications with the current tenant situation. She looked up, eyes wide. Lena, I think this is about you. I think they've been planning to shut down the diner and sell that land, and something about you was getting in the way. Lena felt the floor tilt slightly beneath her. I don't understand. I'm just a waitress. Why would I be a complication in some real estate deal? Rex had gone very still, staring at the phone, his expression unreadable, in a way Lena hadn't seen from him before. Marcus Whitfield, he said slowly. That name mean anything to anyone. Cole was already typing fast, his brow furrowed in concentration. Give me a second. A long pause, the only sound in the room, the rapid clicking of keys. Then he sat back, his face pale. Marcus Whitfield. Regional developer based 2 counties over. His company's been buying up small-town properties across 3 states for the last 5 years. Diners feed stores, old motels. Buys them cheap sites on them, then flips the land once zoning changes go through for big commercial development. He turned the laptop around so the others could see. Look at this. Route 9 corridor's been earmarked for a highway expansion project. If that goes through, every parcel along this stretch triples in value overnight. So Dennis isn't just a bad boss, Lena said slowly, the pieces beginning to align in her mind, even as her stomach twisted at the implications. He's part of something bigger. Looks that way, Rex said. Question is how deep it goes and what exactly you saw or did that made you a complication in their plans. Lena's mind raced backwards, searching through months of memory for anything that might explain it, any conversation overheard, any document glimpsed, anything at all that could tie her, however unknowingly, to a real estate scheme worth potentially millions of dollars. And then it hit her sudden and cold, like a door swinging open onto a room she'd forgotten existed. The safe, she whispered. What safe? Rex asked. There's a safe in the back office. Dennis always kept it locked, never let any of us near it. But about 2 months ago, I was cleaning back there after hours, and the door was open, just a crack. He must have forgotten to close it all the way. I saw folders inside. Property deeds, I think, though I didn't really look closely. I didn't think anything of it. Her breath had gone shallow, but he caught me looking. He came around the corner and saw me standing near it. And that was the night he grabbed my wrist so hard it left a mark for a week. I always thought it was just him being him. But what if it wasn't? The room fell into a heavy, charged silence. What if, Rex said slowly, he panicked because he thought you'd seen something you shouldn't have. And every time since then, every bit of control, every threat that wasn't just abuse for its own sake, That was a man trying to keep a witness silent. Lena felt sick, the full weight of it settling over her at once. Months of fear, of bruises, of forced smiles, all of it potentially tangled up in something far larger and far more dangerous than she'd ever imagined. Something that had nothing to do with eggs or coffee or register discrepancies, and everything to do with millions of dollars riding on a highway expansion deal. "I need to sit down," she said, though she was already sitting, the words coming out reflexively, her whole body suddenly too heavy to hold itself upright. Rex crossed the room and crouched in front of her chair, his hands resting lightly on her knees, grounding steady. "Hey, look at me." She did, her eyes wet, her breath still coming too fast. "None of this is your fault. You understand. You didn't ask to see anything. You didn't ask to be caught up in whatever this is. But now that we know, we're not letting it go. Whatever Dennis and this Whitfield character are planning, it ends. You're safe, I promise you that." "You can't promise that," she whispered. "Watch me." The next several days passed in a blur of careful, quiet investigation. Cole dug deeper into Whitfield's development company, uncovering a pattern that stretched back years. Small business owners across multiple counties who'd sold their properties under mysterious circumstances, several after facing sudden financial trouble, code violations that appeared out of nowhere, or in 2 cases, criminal accusations that fell apart almost as quickly as they'd been filed. "It's a pattern," Cole said, laying printouts across the kitchen table like puzzle pieces. "Whitfield identifies a property he wants, applies pressure through local connections, sheriffs, code enforcement, whoever's willing to play ball. Owner gets desperate, sells cheap, usually to a shell company that traces back to Whitfield eventually, though he's careful to keep several layers between himself and the actual purchase." "And Dennis?" Lena asked. "Dennis bought that diner 8 years ago with cash that doesn't trace to any legitimate loan," Duke said. "My guess, and it's just a guess right now, Whitfield fronted him the money, made him a local face for the operation. Dennis runs the diner, keeps it just profitable enough to look legitimate, and in exchange, when the highway deal finally goes through, he gets a cut of the sale." "Which means he's not just protecting himself," Rex said. "He's protecting a payout that's probably worth more than that diner's made in its entire 8 years combined." Lena sat with the weight of that for a long moment. Every threat, every controlling word, every bruise, all of it in the end hadn't been about her at all. It had been about money. About a man terrified of losing a payday he'd been quietly building toward for nearly a decade, willing to break a woman down to nothing rather than risk that payout slipping away. The realization should have made her angrier. Instead, strangely, it made the fear loosen its grip just slightly, replaced by something colder and more focused. "I want to help," she said. Every head at the table turned toward her. "Lena," Rex said carefully, "you don't have to be part of this. You've already been through enough." "I know I don't have to be." She straightened, meeting his eyes, and felt something steady settle into her spine that hadn't been there in longer than she could remember. "But I worked in that diner for 2 years. I know things about Dennis's schedule, his habits, places. He keeps things, people he talks to. If there's a way to help take this down to make sure he can't do this to anyone else, I want to be part of it." Rex studied her for a long moment, something like pride flickering behind his eyes. "All right," he said finally, "then let's figure out what you know." What Lena knew, it turned out, was more than any of them expected. She remembered the name Marcus Whitfield, now vaguely a man who'd come to the diner twice over the past year, always after hours, always ushered straight back to Dennis's office without ordering so much as a coffee. She remembered a night months ago when she'd stayed late to finish inventory and overheard raised voices from behind the office door. Dennis's voice, tight with something that sounded almost like fear, saying, "We need more time. The town's not going to just roll over on this." And another voice, colder, more controlled, replying, "You've had 2 years. Get it done or I find someone who can." She remembered, too, a stack of certified letters that had arrived at the diner over the past several months. Letters Dennis had always intercepted before she or Carrie could see them, tucking them quickly into his jacket pocket with a tightness around his mouth that she'd never thought to question at the time. "Certified letters," Duke said, writing it down. "That's worth checking. Could be code violation notices, could be something from the county about the highway project. Either way, it's a paper trail." "There's something else," Lena said slowly. A memory surfacing that she hadn't thought about in months, buried beneath so much fear it had simply slipped away until now. "About 4 months ago, an older woman came into the diner. I didn't recognize her. She wasn't a regular. She asked to speak to Dennis, said something about her late husband's property, the old feed store building. Dennis got very tense, very fast, hustled her into the office. When she left, she was crying. I remember because it stuck with me. She looked so lost walking out to her car. Do you remember her name? Rex asked. Lena closed her eyes, straining against the memory. Dennis called her Mrs. Pruitt, I think. Eleanor, maybe, I'm not sure. Cole was already typing. A moment later, he looked up, his expression grim. Eleanor Pruitt, widow. Her husband owned the old feed store building until his death 2 years ago. Property transferred to her, and then, he scrolled further, sold 8 months later to Frell Route 9 LLC for roughly a third of its assessed value. That's her, Lena said, certainty flooding through her. That's the same building on the list Duke found earlier, the vacant one. If she sold under pressure, Rex said slowly, and if we can find her, get her to talk about what happened, that's a direct link between Dennis and a pattern of coercion. That's not just circumstantial anymore. That's a real case. I can find her, Cole said. Give me a day. It took him less than that. By the following afternoon, they had an address, a small house on the edge of the next county over, where Eleanor Pruitt, 73 years old and living alone since her husband's passing, answered the door with the wary, tired eyes of a woman who had learned the hard way not to trust easily. Lena went with Rex to speak with her, insisting on it despite his hesitation. Some instinct telling her that another woman who understood what it meant to be worn down and cornered might have better luck earning Eleanor's trust than a stranger in a leather vest, however gentle his intentions. Mrs. Pruitt, Lena said softly, standing on the porch. My name is Lena. I used to work at the diner on Route 9. I think you might have met the owner, Dennis Frell, about a year ago. Something in the old woman's face shifted at the name, a flinch, quick and involuntary. The same kind of flinch Lena had spent months trying to hide in her own reflection. I don't want any trouble, Eleanor said, her voice thin. I understand, Lena said. I really do. I'm not here to cause you trouble. I'm here because I think the same people who hurt you might have hurt me too. And I think together we might be able to stop them from hurting anyone else. Eleanor stood in her doorway for a long moment, studying Lena's face with the particular scrutiny of someone measuring whether a stranger's kindness could be trusted. Whatever she saw there, and Lena would never know exactly what it was, seemed to settle something in the old woman's chest. You'd better come in, Eleanor said, finally stepping back from the door. I suppose it's time somebody heard the truth about what happened to my Harold's building. The story Eleanor told them over tea that neither Lena nor Rex touched unfolded slowly, painfully, in the careful, halting sentences of someone who had spent a long time trying to forget. Her husband Harold had run the feed store for 31 years before his heart gave out, leaving Eleanor the building free and clear, along with modest savings that were meant to see her through her remaining years in comfort. Within months of his passing, a man named Marcus Whitfield had approached her directly, offering to buy the building, a fair offer he'd said generous, even given how long it had sat unused. She'd declined. The building held 31 years of her husband's life inside its walls, and she wasn't ready to let it go for any price. That was when things had started going wrong. Code enforcement notices arrived citing violations that had never existed under Harold's watch. A fire inspection turned up supposed hazards that a second independent inspector hired quietly by Eleanor's nephew found no evidence of whatsoever. Her homeowner's insurance inexplicably was canceled without warning, leaving the building uninsured and vulnerable. And finally, Dennis Frell himself had come to see her. Not Whitfield. Always Dennis, the friendly local face of an operation Eleanor never fully understood, telling her gently, sympathetically, that it might be easier, might save her a world of legal trouble and expense if she simply sold now before things got any more complicated. I was so tired, Eleanor said, her voice breaking slightly. So tired of fighting people I couldn't even see. Every time I turned around, there was some new problem, some new expense, some new threat wrapped up in a smile. I just wanted it to be over. So you sold, Lena said gently, for a third of what it was worth. I know that now. I didn't know it then, or I did somewhere, but I was too exhausted to fight it anymore. Eleanor wiped her eyes with a trembling hand. That building was the last piece of Harold I had left, and I let them take it because I didn't know what else to do. Rex, who had been quiet through most of the conversation, finally spoke, his voice low and steady. Mrs. Pruitt, would you be willing to put what you just told us in writing, a sworn statement? It could help stop this from happening to anyone else. Eleanor looked up at him, something hardening behind her tired eyes. Will it help get that man in trouble, the one who smiled at me while he was taking everything Harold worked for? It might, Rex said honestly. I won't promise you it's easy or fast, but it's a start. Eleanor was quiet for a long moment, and then she nodded slow and firm. Then yes, I'll write it down. Every bit of it. They left Eleanor's house as the sun was beginning to set, the sworn statement folded carefully in Rex's jacket pocket, and Lena walked back to the truck in silence, her mind heavy with everything they'd just uncovered. She's not the only one, she said finally, as Rex pulled out onto the road. Is she? There's probably more people like her. More people Dennis and Whitfield ground down until they gave up their property for pennies on the dollar. Probably, Rex admitted, which means this is bigger than just clearing your name. This is a whole pattern that's been running under this town's nose for years, and nobody's ever connected the dots before now. Because nobody had a reason to look, Lena said quietly. Nobody until a waitress got fired for asking too many questions. Rex glanced over at her, something softening in his expression. You did that, not us. You're the one who remembered the safe, remembered Eleanor's visit, put the first pieces together. Don't sell yourself short in this story, Lena. You're not just the woman this happened to. You're the reason it's about to unravel. She let that settle over her, strange and unfamiliar, the idea that she might be something other than a victim. In this story, that she might instead be the one who finally brought the whole rotten structure crashing down. It was a good feeling, a dangerous one too, because good feelings had a way of making people careless, and Lena Carter, of all people, understood exactly how quickly carelessness could cost someone everything. She didn't know yet just how right that instinct would turn out to be, because 3 days later, someone would break into the garage in the dead of night, and what they'd come looking for would prove beyond any doubt exactly how far Dennis Frell and Marcus Whitfield were willing to go to keep their secret buried. The sound that woke Lena wasn't loud. That was what made it terrifying. Not a crash, not breaking glass, but a soft, deliberate scrape of metal against metal, coming from somewhere below the guest room, somewhere near the garage's back entrance. She sat bolt upright in the dark heart, slamming every instinct honed by months of learning to listen for danger, screaming at once that something was wrong. She grabbed her phone and with shaking hands texted the one word she never thought she'd need to send from inside a place that was supposed to be safe. Someone's here. The reply came almost instantly. Rex slept light, she'd learn later, a habit from a life she still knew almost nothing about. Stay in the room, lock the door, don't come out. She did exactly that, pressing herself against the wall beside the door, straining to hear over the roar of her own pulse in her ears. Footsteps downstairs. Careful, slow. Someone who didn't want to be heard moving through the garage with the kind of purpose that suggested they knew exactly what they were looking for. Then came Rex's voice, sudden and sharp from somewhere below. Hands where I can see them. Now. A crash. A scuffle. The unmistakable sound of a body hitting the floor hard, followed by Duke's voice low and furious, and then abruptly, silence. Lena stood frozen behind the locked door for what felt like an eternity before Rex's voice came again, closer this time, calling up the stairs. It's over. You can come down. Her legs barely held her as she descended, and what she found in the garage stopped her cold. A man, young, maybe late 20s, dressed in dark clothes, a duffel bag spilled open on the floor beside him, containing what looked like a crowbar, and a flashlight sat pinned against the wall between Tank's massive forearm and Duke's unwavering glare, his face pale with fear. He was going straight for the file cabinet, Rex said, nodding toward the corner of the garage where Cole kept his printouts, his research, everything they'd gathered on Whitfield and Dennis over the past week. Not the truck, not the tools, straight for the files. That's not a coincidence, Cole said grimly, already crouched beside the cabinet, checking what, if anything, had been touched. Lena stared at the young man's face, and something about his eyes wide, terrified clearly out of his depth, struck her as wrong for a professional break-in. Who sent you? She asked, stepping closer, despite the tremor still running through her hands. The young man's eyes flicked to her, and something in his expression cracked. I didn't want to do this, he said, voice shaking. He said it was just paperwork, said nobody would even be here. Who said that? Rex's voice had gone hard, dangerous in a way Lena hadn't heard from him before. Boyd. Sheriff Boyd. The young man swallowed hard. Mom, he's my uncle. Said there were some files here that needed to disappear before they caused trouble for people who mattered. Said it was no big deal in and out, nobody would even know. The room went completely still. The sheriff sent his own nephew to break into a private residence and steal evidence. Rex said slowly, each word deliberate, like he was making sure everyone in the room understood the full weight of what had just been confirmed. That's not protecting a friend anymore. That's obstruction. That's a federal problem now, not just a local one. So, they called the state police that night, rather than the county sheriff's office. An easy decision once everyone understood exactly how compromised Boyd had become. And by morning, a detective named Reyes arrived from the State Investigative Division, a sharp-eyed woman in her 40s who listened to the entire story without interruption, her expression growing more serious with every new detail. "Let me make sure I understand this correctly," Reyes said, flipping back through her notes. "You've got a diner owner accused of assault and false theft accusations. A local sheriff apparently compromised by a personal connection to that same diner owner. A pattern of coercive property acquisitions stretching back years tied to a developer named Marcus Whitfield. And now an attempted burglary ordered by the sheriff himself targeting evidence related to all of the above." "That's the shape of it," Rex confirmed. "And you have a sworn statement from one of the victims already." "Eleanor Pruitt," Lena said. "She sold her late husband's property for a third of its value after months of harassment. We believe there are others." Reyes was quiet for a long moment, tapping her pen against her notepad. "This is bigger than a single county matter," she finally said. "If Whitfield's been running this pattern across multiple counties, and if he's got law enforcement compromised in more than one jurisdiction, this needs to go up the chain. I'd like to bring in someone from the state attorney general's office, possibly federal if the property fraud crosses state lines, which given Whitfield's operating radius, it very likely does." Lena felt something tighten in her chest. Not fear this time, but the enormous dizzying scale of what had begun as a single bruised wrist and a stolen paycheck accusation now unfolding into something that might genuinely reach all the way to Washington. "What happens to me in all this?" she asked quietly. "The theft accusation against me, is that going to just disappear, or is this going to drag on forever?" Reyes' expression softened slightly. "Given what we now know about the sheriff's compromise involvement, I think it's safe to say that complaint isn't going to hold up to any real scrutiny. But I won't lie to you, this kind of investigation takes time. Weeks, possibly months. You'll need to be prepared to testify possibly more than once." "I understand," Lena said, and found to her own surprise that she meant it. The fear was still there, coiled tight somewhere beneath her ribs, but underneath it now sat something steadier. A resolve that hadn't existed in her a month ago, back when survival meant nothing more than concealer and long sleeves and silence. Still, the investigation moved faster than any of them expected, propelled forward by the sheer scale of what Reyes' team began uncovering once they had legal authority to dig properly. Bank records, property transfers, communications between Whitfield's shell companies and half a dozen local officials across 3 counties, all of them apparently willing for the right price to look the other way, while vulnerable property owners were quietly squeezed out of what belonged to them. Dennis was arrested 6 days after the failed burglary attempt, taken from the diner in handcuffs during what would have been the lunch rush, the whole scene witnessed by a dining room full of stunned regulars who had spent years thinking they knew the man behind the counter. Lena learned about it from Marge, who called sobbing with relief, her voice shaking as she described watching 2 state troopers walk Dennis out the front door, while Carrie stood frozen behind the register, unable to process what she was seeing. "They found things in that safe," Marge said. "The one you told them about. Deeds, contracts, records going back years. Honey, it's everything. It's everything you said and more." Lena sat on the edge of the guest bed after the call ended, phone still clutched in her hand, feeling the strange, disorienting vertigo of watching a nightmare she'd survived for over a year suddenly collapse in on itself in the space of a single phone call. "You okay?" Rex asked from the doorway, watching her carefully. "I don't know what I feel," she admitted. "Relief, I think, but also I don't know. Empty almost. Like I've been braced for a blow for so long that I don't know what to do with my hands now that it's not coming." Rex crossed the room and sat beside her close, but not crowding her, the same careful distance he'd maintained since the night he'd picked her up off that bus bench. "That's normal," he said. "More normal than you'd think. Takes time to unlearn bracing for a hit that isn't coming anymore." "How do you know so much about this?" She asked the questions, slipping out before she could stop it. Curiosity finally overtaking the caution she'd maintained around the parts of his life he'd never fully explained. You keep saying you've seen this before. Watched it happen. What does that mean, Rex? He was quiet for a long moment, his eyes fixed somewhere past her on some memory she couldn't see. My sister, he said finally, voice low, rougher than she'd ever heard it. Long time ago, different man, different town, but the same playbook. Control the money, control the fear, isolate her from anyone who might help. He paused, jaw tightening. I wasn't around enough back then to see it happening. Was overseas military, came home 18 months too late to do anything but bury her. Lena's breath caught the weight of what he'd just shared, landing heavy and sudden. Rex, I'm so sorry. It's a long time ago now. He said it simply without self-pity, though the old grief was still visible, carved somewhere into the lines around his eyes. But it's why I notice, why I've always noticed every diner, every gas station, every town we roll through. I told myself a long time ago I wasn't going to be 18 months too late again. Not if I could help it. So that day at the diner, you weren't just being kind to a stranger. No, he admitted. I saw my sister in you the second you flinched when Dennis got close. And I made myself a promise a long time ago that if I ever saw that look again, I wasn't going to just drive on by. Lena reached out hesitant and rested her hand over his, the gesture small but deliberate, the first time she'd initiated any kind of touch since the night he'd found her on that bench. Thank you, she said quietly, for not driving on by. He turned his hand beneath hers, palm up, fingers curling gently around hers in response. Thank you for calling that night. Took guts I know most people don't have. They sat together in the quiet for a long moment, the weight of everything they'd both survived settling into something that felt for the first time less like grief and more like understanding. The case against Dennis and Whitfield exploded into something far larger over the following weeks, exactly as Reyes had predicted. Federal investigators became involved once the interstate nature of Whitfield's operation was confirmed, uncovering a pattern of coercive property acquisition that stretched across 5 counties and involved no fewer than 11 separate victims. Several of them elderly widows like Eleanor Pruitt. One, a young single mother who'd lost her deceased father's auto shop under eerily similar circumstances. Sheriff Boyd was arrested and charged alongside 2 other local officials in neighboring counties. All 3 of them accused of accepting payments in exchange for manufacturing code violations, burying complaints, and in Boyd's case, directing an attempted burglary to destroy evidence. Lena testified twice before a grand jury, her hands shaking each time she walked into the courthouse. Rex waiting outside both times despite not being permitted in the room itself, standing at the base of the courthouse steps like a promise kept. You don't have to be scared, he told her the second time before she went in. You've already survived the hardest part. This is just telling the truth to people who are finally ready to listen. What if they don't believe me? They will. And even if some part of you is scared they won't, you tell the truth anyway. That's all courage ever really is, Lena. Doing the right thing scared. She walked into that courthouse with her chin lifted, her voice steady, and told the truth from beginning to end. The bruises, the threats, the safe, the fear that had governed every single day of her life for over a year. And when she walked back out 2 hours later, drained but upright, Rex was exactly where he'd said he'd be. It was during the 5th week of the investigation that the twist none of them saw coming finally surfaced, a discovery that reframed everything they thought they understood about the scope of Whitfield's operation. Cole found it buried in financial records subpoenaed by Reyes's team, a pattern of payments flowing not just to Boyd and the other local officials, but to a state assembly man named Harlan Voss, a man responsible for sitting on the very committee that had quietly approved the Route 9 highway expansion project years ahead of any public announcement. He knew, Cole said, staring at the numbers on his screen with something like disbelief. Voss knew about the expansion project 2 full years before it went public. He tipped off Whitfield, early gave him a head start on buying up cheap property before anyone else even knew what was coming. That's not just corruption. That's insider information worth millions. A state assemblyman, Rex said slowly, absorbing the scale of it. This isn't a local scheme anymore. This reaches all the way up. Reyes confirmed it 2 days later, her voice grim over the phone. We're bringing in the state attorney general's office directly now, possibly the FBI given the scope. Voss's involvement changes everything. This isn't a handful of corrupt local officials protecting a diner owner's shady real estate deals anymore. This is a coordinated fraud scheme that potentially cost taxpayers millions and stole property from a dozen vulnerable homeowners across multiple counties, orchestrated in part by a sitting elected official. Lena sat with that news for a long time after the call ended, staring out the small window of the guest room, trying to reconcile the magnitude of what her single terrifying moment of honesty in a diner had ultimately set into motion. "I never wanted any of this," she said quietly when Rex found her there later. "I just wanted the bruises to stop." "I know." He sat beside her, his voice gentle. "But sometimes the smallest act of courage cracks open something a lot bigger than anyone expects. You didn't ask for any of this, Lena, but you didn't run from it either once it started. That matters. That matters more than you know." 11 other people, she said, 11 other families who lost something because of this. And it might have kept going, might have kept happening to more people if Dennis hadn't grabbed my wrist hard enough in front of the wrong stranger. "Maybe," Rex said, "or maybe it would have unraveled some other way some other day. But it didn't happen some other way. It happened because you were brave enough to call a number folded into your apron pocket on a night you had every reason in the world to just give up." He reached over, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear, the gesture careful, tender, entirely unlike anything she'd experienced from anyone in longer than she could remember. "Don't carry guilt for surviving something that led to justice for other people too. That's not how this works."
Itahan.
The final piece fell into place 3 weeks later when Marcus Whitfield himself was arrested at a private airfield 2 states away, apparently attempting to flee the country before federal charges could be formally filed. The arrest made regional news, then national. The scale of the fraud scheme now estimated at over $4 million in stolen property value, proving too significant a story for the media to ignore. Reporters descended on the small town along Route 9 within days, hungry for the human story behind the headline numbers, and it was Eleanor Pruitt of all people who stepped forward, first giving an interview on the courthouse steps that left half the county in tears, describing in her thin, steady voice exactly what it had cost her to lose the last piece of her husband she had left. Lena watched the interview from the small television in Rex's living room, Eleanor's words landing with a weight that felt entirely different now than it had the day they'd first sat together over untouched tea. "She's not scared anymore," Lena said softly, watching the old woman's face on screen, steady and clear-eyed in front of a dozen cameras. "She looks like she's finally standing up straight again." "That's what happens," Rex said, "when the truth finally gets to see daylight. Takes time, but it happens." Lena thought about her own reflection in that cracked bathroom mirror, all those mornings of concealer and long sleeves and forced smiles, and felt something in her chest settle into a shape that hadn't existed there in over a year. Something that might eventually, with enough time and enough daylight, come to resemble peace. But peace, she was beginning to understand, wasn't the end of the story. It was only the beginning of learning how to live inside a life that finally truly belonged to her again. And what that new life might look like with a man who'd promised never to drive on by again was a question she was only just beginning to let herself imagine answering. The trial began on a Monday in early October, and by the time Lena walked through the courthouse doors for opening statements, she had already learned to recognize the particular quality of silence that fell over a room when everyone inside it understood exactly how much was at stake. Dennis sat at the defendant's table beside 2 other men she'd never met in person, but had come to know intimately through months of depositions and evidence review. Marcus Whitfield, composed and expensively dressed, and even now, and Harlan Voss, the assemblyman, whose face had been plastered across every regional news outlet for the better part of 2 months. Sheriff Boyd had already taken a plea deal weeks earlier, agreeing to testify against the others in exchange for a reduced sentence, and Lena had felt no satisfaction in that news, only a hollow kind of relief that at least one part of this was finally settled. "You ready?" Rex asked quietly, sitting beside her in the gallery, his hand resting near hers on the wooden bench, not quite touching, giving her the choice. She took it, lacing her fingers through his. "No," she admitted, "but I'm here anyway." That's all ready ever really means. Neto. The prosecution's case unfolded over 11 days, methodical and relentless, laying out the full architecture of what Whitfield Voss and their network of compromised local officials had built over nearly a decade. Eleanor Pruitt testified on the 3rd day, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands, describing in careful detail exactly how fear and exhaustion had been weaponized against her until she'd signed away the last piece of her husband's legacy for a fraction of its worth. Two other victims followed: a retired mechanic who'd lost his shop, a young widow who'd nearly lost her home before her neighbors rallied around her each account, another thread in a tapestry of coercion that had operated in plain sight for years, hidden behind smiling faces and friendly small-town handshakes. Lena testified on the seventh day. She had rehearsed it in her mind 100 times, walking up to that moment, and still standing in the witness box with Dennis's eyes fixed on her from across the courtroom, she felt her carefully prepared composure threaten to crack. "Miss Carter," the prosecutor said gently, "can you describe for the court what your daily life looked like working under Mr. Frell's employment?" Lena's eyes found Rex's steady in the gallery, and something in his expression, patient, unwavering, utterly certain, gave her the footing she needed. "Every morning," she said, her voice finding strength as she spoke, "I woke up and I covered my bruises with makeup before I went to work, because if anyone saw them, I was afraid of what would happen. Not just to my job, to me." She paused, drawing breath. "I told myself for over a year that this was just what survival looked like, that I didn't have another option." He made sure I believed that, every single day. And when did that change? The day a stranger walked into that diner and told me out loud for the first time in longer than I can remember that none of it was my fault. Her voice cracked slightly, but she pushed through it. I didn't believe him at first, but he kept showing up. And eventually I believed it enough to make a phone call that changed everything. Dennis's attorney rose for cross-examination, attempting to paint her testimony as motivated by a personal relationship with Rex, an attempt to discredit the very courage that had brought this entire case into daylight. But Lena had grown far beyond the woman who once shrank from confrontation, and she met every question with a steadiness that seemed to surprise even the attorney himself. "Isn't it true," the attorney pressed, "that you developed a romantic relationship with one of the men who helped bring this case forward, that your testimony might be colored by that relationship?" "It's true that Rex Malone and I have grown close," Lena said clearly, "in the months since he stood up in that diner and told my boss to stop hurting me. But the bruises on my body before that day were real. The threats were real. The safe full of stolen deeds was real. None of that required a relationship to be true. It just required someone willing to finally believe me." The courtroom stayed silent for a long moment after that answer, and even the attorney visibly had nothing left to press. The verdict came on a gray Thursday afternoon in late October, after 9 hours of jury deliberation that had stretched Lena's nerves thin enough to feel like they might snap entirely. Dennis Frell guilty on all counts: assault, coercion, filing false police reports, conspiracy to commit fraud. Marcus Whitfield guilty on charges of racketeering, wire fraud, and conspiracy spanning 5 counties. Harlan Voss guilty on charges of bribery, insider corruption, and misuse of public office. Lena sat in the gallery as the verdicts were read, one after another, and felt something inside her chest that had been clenched tight for over a year and finally completely release. She didn't cry. She'd expected to cry. Instead, she simply sat very still, Rex's hand tight around hers, and breathed, really breathed, deep and unhurried, for what felt like the first time in longer than she could remember. Outside the courthouse afterward, cameras and reporters swarmed the steps shouting questions. But Lena walked through them with her chin lifted. Rex beside her, Marge and Carrie and Eleanor. Pruitt clustered close around her like a small, fierce wall of protection. A young reporter pushed a microphone toward her. "Miss Carter, how does it feel knowing your testimony helped bring down a corruption scheme worth millions?" Lena stopped, considered the question, and answered it honestly, the way she'd learned to answer everything now. "It feels like the first time in years that the truth mattered more than in staying quiet," she said. "I hope every person watching this who's scared to speak up understands it's never too late. Somebody is always willing to listen if you're brave enough to say it out loud." The months that followed unfolded in a rhythm Lena had never allowed herself to imagine. During the worst of her days at that diner, a rhythm built not around survival, but around something startlingly close to an ordinary, peaceful life. She moved into a small apartment of her own 2 towns over, close enough to visit Marge and Carrie regularly, far enough that Route 9 diner shuttered, now its windows dark, awaiting new ownership, under a settlement that would eventually see the property return fairly to the community, no longer cast a shadow over her daily life. She found work at a bakery run by a woman named Josephine Warm and Unhurried, who never once raised her voice, never once made Lena flinch when she reached for something on a high shelf. The work was simple bread pastries, the quiet satisfaction of flour on her hands, and the smell of something rising in an oven. And it healed something in her that she hadn't fully realized needed healing until she felt it happening. Rex visited often, though. He never pushed, never assumed, always waiting for her to set the pace of whatever they were slowly becoming to each other. Some nights they simply sat together on her small balcony, saying very little comfortable, in a silence that had nothing frightened buried inside it. "You seem lighter," he told her one evening. Months after the verdict, watching her laugh at something Carrie had said over the phone, a real laugh, unguarded, nothing like the careful performative smile she'd once worn like armor. "I feel lighter," she admitted. "I keep waiting for it to be temporary, for something to come along and take it away again." "It won't," Rex said with the same steady certainty he'd carried since the very first day. "Not because bad things won't ever happen again. They will, that's just life. But because you're not the same woman who walked into that diner every morning, afraid of her own reflection. You know your own strength now. Nobody can take that away from you again." She believed him. That was the strangest part of all, that after everything, after a lifetime of learning not to trust easy words from anyone, she believed him completely. Eleanor Pruitt used a portion of the restitution settlement to establish a small foundation in her late husband's name, the Harold Pruitt Fund, dedicated to providing legal aid to elderly and vulnerable property owners facing coercive real estate practices, ensuring no one else would ever again sit alone at a kitchen table, exhausted and frightened, signing away a lifetime's legacy because no one had shown them another way out. Lena attended the foundation's opening ceremony on a bright spring morning, standing beside Rex, watching Eleanor cut a simple ribbon with hands that no longer trembled the way they once had. "None of this would exist," Eleanor said in her remarks to the small gathered crowd, "if a young waitress hadn't been brave enough to remember what she saw in a back office safe and brave enough to speak it out loud when it mattered most." Her eyes found Lena's across the small crowd, warm and grateful. Sometimes the bravest thing a person can do isn't some grand dramatic act. It's simply refusing to stay silent one more day than they already have. The crowd's applause washed over Lena, and she felt Rex's hand find hers, steady as it had always been since that very first night on the bus bench, and she understood with a clarity that felt almost overwhelming just how far the distance had been between the woman hiding bruises under concealer and the woman standing here now, no longer hiding anything at all. It was nearly a year to the day since the Hells Angels had first rolled into Route 9 Diner that Rex asked her to marry him, not with any grand gesture, not with cameras or crowds or performance of any kind, but quietly on her small balcony under an ordinary evening sky, in the same unhurried voice he'd used the very first time he'd asked if she was okay. "I'm not a complicated man," he said, holding a small ring that had clearly been chosen with more care than its simplicity suggested. "I can't promise you a life without hard days. I've seen too much of the world to make promises like that. But I can promise you this: I will never once look away from you again. Not when things are hard, not when things are easy. I see you, Lena Carter. I've seen you since the first morning you walked into that diner. And I intend to keep seeing you every single day for as long as you'll let me." She said yes before he'd even finished the sentence, and the laugh that broke out of her afterward was the same unguarded real laugh that had once felt so foreign to her own voice, now as natural and familiar as breathing. They were married that autumn in a small backyard ceremony that Lena had once in her darkest days at that diner never imagined she would live to see. Marge cried through the entire thing. Carrie, now enrolled in her second year of community college, stood as Lena's maid of honor, beaming with a pride that felt like it belonged to both of them equally. Eleanor Pruitt sat in the front row beside Duke, Cole, and Tank, an unlikely family assembled from the wreckage of a nightmare none of them had asked for, but all of them had survived together. And when Rex slid the ring onto her finger, his hands as steady as they'd been every single day since that first quiet moment in the diner, Lena thought back one last time to the woman she'd been before all of this. The woman who checked her reflection in a cracked mirror every morning, calculating exactly how much concealer it would take to hide what the world wasn't supposed to see. The woman who had convinced herself that survival was the same thing as living, because she had never once been given a reason to believe there could be a difference. That woman was gone now, Not erased, not forgotten. Lena carried her still somewhere underneath everything she'd become a quiet reminder of exactly how far she'd traveled to arrive at this single, ordinary, extraordinary moment. The roar of motorcycle engines filled the small backyard as the reception began. Dozens of riders who had become over the past years something closer to family than Lena had ever known. Outside of bloodmen, who had once seemed frightening to a town that judged them by their leather jackets and their patches, but who had shown up again and again for a woman none of them owed a single thing to simply because it was the right thing to do. Lena stood in the center of it all, Rex's hands steady in hers, and understood finally and completely the truth she had spent over a year learning the hardest way possible. She had never been weak. She had only been alone. And now, surrounded by every person who had refused to let her stay that way, she was not invisible anymore. Not to Rex, not to this town, not to herself. She was seen. She was safe. She was at long last entirely and unshakably free.